My 6-year-old son didn't ask why his father hadn't come home. He looked up from the Lego castle we'd been building, held a tiny blue block between his fingers, and asked in a voice so quiet it barely reached me. "Mom, if Dad gets another family, do I still belong to yours?" The block slipped from my hand. It landed on the hardwood floor with a sound so small it should have meant nothing. Instead, it shattered the last excuse I had spent 5 years clinging to. I had survived the affairs. I had survived the lies. I had survived pretending that every business trip, every late-night meeting, every lipstick stain I quietly wiped off a dress shirt meant nothing at all, because I believed I could protect my children long enough to secure their future. I was willing to let my marriage die quietly. I was never willing to let my children inherit its wounds. I knelt in front of Noah, brushed his hair away from his forehead, and forced my hands to stop trembling. "What made you ask me that?" He looked toward the window instead of at me. "Dad's friend said families change." A pause. "She said nice boys learn to love their new moms." The room suddenly felt too small. Outside, the maple trees behind our Boston home swayed gently in the October wind. Inside, every promise my husband had ever made collapsed without making a sound. I kissed Noah's forehead. "You only have one mother." He searched my face. "You'll never leave?" "No." It was the easiest promise I had ever made, because 10 minutes earlier, I had signed the final authorization for my divorce attorney to file the petition. Not because my husband cheated, not because he lied, not even because another woman believed she deserved my life. I filed because, for the first time, their games had reached my children. And once that happened, there was nothing left to save. By the time the divorce papers were on my attorney's desk, my husband still believed he had all the time in the world. That was Ethan Whitmore's greatest talent. Not building billion-dollar healthcare systems, not charming investors, not winning over hospital boards. It was convincing himself that every mistake came with another chance. Every affair could be forgiven. Every promise could be postponed. Every woman would still be waiting when he finally decided to come home. For years, I had been one of them. The Whitmore Health Network wasn't just another private hospital chain. Across Massachusetts and New Hampshire, our family's name stood above children's hospitals, cancer centers, rehabilitation clinics, and medical research campuses that treated hundreds of thousands of patients every year. People trusted the Whitmore name. Doctors built careers under it. Communities depended on it. From the outside, we looked like the family featured on magazine covers. A respected founder, an elegant charitable foundation, a successful heir, a devoted wife, 2 beautiful children. The photographs were never lies. They simply never showed what happened after the cameras left. 5 years earlier, I had believed every word Ethan ever whispered. I met him during a healthcare technology conference in Chicago. I was designing patient information systems for public hospitals then, working 18-hour days because I genuinely believed technology could save lives. He wasn't arrogant back then, at least not around me. He carried my laptop after a seminar because he noticed the strap had snapped. He remembered how I took my coffee. He drove 3 hours through a snowstorm just to bring me antibiotics. When I caught pneumonia during a consulting project. When someone loves you before they ever betray you, that's the cruelest part. The memories refuse to become ugly, even after everything else does. We married less than 2 years later. Richard Whitmore welcomed me into the family with a handshake instead of a hug. "I don't care where you came from," he had said. "I only care whether you keep your word." At the time, I thought he was intimidating. Years later, I realized he had quietly told me the only rule that truly mattered inside this family. Helen, my mother-in-law, remained polite but distant. She wasn't cold, she simply observed people before deciding who they really were. I respected that. Then Noah was born. 2 years later, Emma arrived. For a while, our home actually sounded like happiness. Tiny footsteps across wooden floors, bedtime stories, pancakes on Sunday mornings, finger paint on walls that expensive contractors had carefully restored. Sometimes Ethan would carry both children through the backyard, while they laughed so hard they could barely breathe. Those moments were real. That's what made everything afterward so difficult. Because monsters rarely exist. People do. People who can kiss their daughter goodnight and spend the rest of the evening in someone else's apartment. I discovered the first affair on an ordinary Tuesday. Not because someone exposed him, not because a private investigator handed me photographs, but because I was looking for Noah's missing soccer cleats in the trunk of Ethan's car. Instead, I found a velvet jewelry pouch. Inside was a diamond bracelet. The receipt wasn't addressed to me, neither was the handwritten card folded beneath it. Thank you for making me feel chosen. Love, M. I remember sitting in the garage for nearly an hour. The engine had already cooled. The house lights glowed warmly through the kitchen window. Inside, my son was probably asking where Mommy had gone. Outside, I stared at 8 words written by a woman I'd never met. Not one tear came, not yet. That night, I asked Ethan exactly one question: who is she? He didn't deny it, he didn't even try. He sat on the edge of our bed, buried his face in both hands, and cried harder than I did. It didn't mean anything. I was stupid. It was over. I'll spend the rest of my life making this right. If I could speak to the woman I was that night, I'd tell her something no one ever tells newly betrayed wives. The first apology is almost never the dangerous one. The dangerous apology is the 10th. Because by then, you're no longer deciding whether to forgive. You're deciding how much of yourself you're willing to lose while waiting for someone else to change. I almost left. I called a lawyer, I looked at apartments, I even packed 2 suitcases for Noah and myself. Then Richard asked if I would visit him at his office. He didn't defend his son. He didn't ask me to stay. He simply opened an old leather folder and placed several documents in front of me. Read them. I spent nearly 20 minutes turning each page. When I finally looked up, I understood why he had called me instead of Ethan. Everything I thought I knew about the Whitmore family was only half the story. Richard Whitmore didn't speak while I finished reading. The office overlooked Boston Harbor, where ferries crossed the gray water beneath a cloudy afternoon sky. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, it was deliberate. When I finally closed the leather folder, my hands felt strangely steady. So, I said quietly, Ethan never showed me any of this. He doesn't know, I looked up. He doesn't know, Richard leaned back in his chair. My son believes ownership and control are the same thing. They're not. Inside the folder wasn't another prenup. It wasn't hidden property. It wasn't a secret inheritance. It was the Whitmore family trust. Nearly 60% of the healthcare network wasn't owned directly by any individual family member. It belonged to the trust, the hospitals, the research campuses, the charitable foundation, even the voting shares. Everything ultimately answered to one legal structure created almost 40 years earlier. Why are you showing me this? I asked. Because you're the only person in this family asking the right question. I frowned. What question? Richard folded his hands together. You asked whether my son betrayed you. A pause. I've been asking whether he's becoming the kind of man who will destroy everything generations before him built. For the first time since discovering Ethan's affair, someone wasn't talking about marriage, they were talking about character. Richard stood and walked toward the window. When I founded this company, I promised myself one thing. My children would inherit opportunity. They would not inherit entitlement. He turned toward me. If Ethan cannot separate his impulses from his responsibilities, he won't inherit this company. I stared at him. You believe it could come to that? I believe it already has. That conversation changed something inside me, not because I suddenly stopped hurting, but because I finally understood my choices weren't limited to staying or leaving. There was a third option: prepare, quietly, completely, without announcing it to anyone. I never canceled the appointment with my attorney, I simply postponed it. 1 month became 6, 6 became a year, then another. People assumed I stayed because I couldn't bear losing my luxurious life. The truth was almost the opposite. I was making sure that when I finally walked away, my children wouldn't lose theirs. Over the next several years, I learned more about the Whitmore Health Network than Ethan ever imagined. Not because Richard ordered me to, because knowledge became the only place where no one could betray me. After putting Noah and Emma to bed each night, I studied financial reports, foundation audits, hospital expansion plans, state healthcare regulations, board voting procedures, trust governance. By midnight, I wasn't reading because Richard had asked me to. I was reading because every page made me less afraid. Pain can make people bitter. It can also make them competent. I chose competence. Ethan never noticed. As long as dinner appeared on time, as long as school events were covered, as long as no one questioned him publicly, he assumed everything at home was functioning exactly as it always had. He mistook silence for surrender. He wasn't the only one. The women at charity galas smiled sympathetically when they thought I couldn't hear. Poor Claire, she'll never leave, she has too much to lose. I smiled back every time. Explaining yourself is exhausting, preparation is quiet. By Noah's 6th birthday, I had stopped checking Ethan's phone, stopped asking where he slept, stopped wondering who was texting after midnight. The answers no longer mattered, only deadlines did. There was one final amendment to the family trust scheduled for approval before the end of the fiscal year. Once it became legally effective, my children's educational trust, medical protection, and inheritance rights could no longer be challenged by any future spouse or additional heirs. That amendment was the finish line. I only had to hold everything together a little longer. Then came the Children's Hope Gala. Every autumn, the Whitmore Foundation hosted one fundraising evening for pediatric cancer research. The ballroom wasn't filled with celebrities. It was filled with surgeons, researchers, philanthropists, families whose children had survived because someone had funded another clinical trial. It was the event Richard valued more than any shareholders' meeting. Emma wore a tiny navy velvet dress. Noah insisted on wearing a bow tie because he wanted to look like Grandpa Richard. Watching my children laugh beneath thousands of warm lights, I almost believed we could make it through one peaceful evening. Then the ballroom doors opened. A woman stepped inside, wearing an elegant emerald gown. She wasn't breathtakingly beautiful. She didn't need to be. Confidence entered the room before she did. Madison Brooks, Director of Public Relations. She worked at Whitmore Health. Most people recognized her professionally. Only a few knew she'd also been sharing my husband's bed. She walked straight toward Ethan, not hurriedly, not nervously, deliberately. She stopped close enough that anyone paying attention would notice, close enough to force a choice. Ethan's smile disappeared. Richard saw her, Helen saw her. I saw every executive pretending not to. No one moved, no one spoke. Madison looked at Ethan first, then at me. Finally, she smiled, not the smile of a woman in love, the smile of someone who believed she had already won. And for the first time in 5 years, I walked toward the other woman instead of waiting for my husband to explain himself. Madison didn't flinch as I approached. Neither did I. People often imagine confrontations beginning with raised voices. Real humiliation is usually much quieter. A string quartet continued playing near the stage. Crystal glasses clinked. Waiters carried silver trays through conversations that suddenly sounded forced. No one wanted to stare. Everyone did. When I stopped in front of Madison, she offered a perfectly rehearsed smile. Mrs. Whitmore, Miss Brooks. Neither of us reached for a handshake. I wasn't sure you'd come over, she said. I wasn't sure you'd have the confidence to come. Her smile tightened almost imperceptibly. I came to support the foundation. No, I looked directly into her eyes. You came because tonight has witnesses. Silence, not awkward, precise. Madison tilted her head slightly. I think you've misunderstood my relationship with Ethan. I don't think about your relationship with Ethan. That answer caught her off guard, only for a second, but I saw it. She had prepared herself for anger, for accusations, for tears. Instead, she found something she didn't know how to fight. Indifference. Behind me, I could sense Ethan moving closer, not to protect me, not to protect her, to protect the illusion. Claire, he said quietly, this isn't the place. I turned toward him. You finally found something that isn't the place. His jaw tightened. Richard had walked across the ballroom by then. Helen followed several steps behind. Neither interrupted. Richard simply observed the same way he observed board meetings. He believed people revealed themselves when no one rescued them. Madison folded her arms. I never intended to disrespect your family. No? I glanced toward Noah, who was laughing with several children beside a charity display where paper cranes covered an entire wall. Then you chose a strange place to test your manners. Her expression hardened. You don't know everything. I know enough. You think staying married makes you the winner. I almost smiled. There it was. The question underneath every affair, not love, competition. Women are too often taught that betrayal is a contest. One wife, one mistress, one prize. No one asks whether the prize is worth winning. I don't measure my life against yours, I said. I measure it against the promises I made to my children. For the first time, Madison looked genuinely confused, almost disappointed. She wanted a rival, she found a mother. Richard stepped between us before either woman spoke again. His voice remained calm. Ms. Brooks, this event raises money for children receiving chemotherapy. If you've come to support them, you're welcome. If you've come for any other reason, this evening is over. There wasn't a hint of anger in his voice. That made it even more devastating. Madison looked toward Ethan, waiting, expecting, begging him without saying a word to stand beside her. He didn't move, not because he had suddenly become honorable, because he was afraid. Afraid of his father, afraid of the board, afraid of headlines, afraid of consequences. She saw it. The realization crossed her face slowly, like someone watching ice crack beneath their feet. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the exit. Her heels echoed across the marble floor. No one stopped her, no one followed. When the doors closed behind her, conversations cautiously resumed. Music returned, wine was poured, fundraising continued. The gala survived. My marriage didn't. Later that evening, after the final guests had left, I stood alone on the hospital's rooftop terrace, overlooking the Boston skyline. Cold air swept across the empty garden. The city lights blurred against the Charles River. Ethan found me there. I ended it. I kept looking at the skyline. With Madison, still silence. I thought that's what you wanted. I laughed. It surprised both of us, not because anything was funny, because I'd forgotten what laughter sounded like. You still don't understand. He frowned. I fixed it. No, I finally looked at him. You removed one symptom. You never treated the disease. His shoulders dropped. I've made mistakes. You built a life out of them. I love you. The words floated between us, years ago. I would have reached for them, protected them, believed them. Now they sounded like a language I no longer spoke. I know you think you do. His eyes reddened. What does that mean? It means you love being forgiven. You love believing another apology resets everything. I stepped closer, not to comfort him, to make sure he heard every word. Love isn't measured by how desperately you want someone after you've hurt them. It's measured by how carefully you protect them before you ever have the chance. His face lost what little color remained. For several long seconds, neither of us moved. Then my phone vibrated. A message from my attorney. The trust amendment has been approved by the board. Your children's protections are now irrevocable. I read the message once, locked the screen, slipped the phone back into my pocket. Nothing changed on my face, everything changed inside me. For 5 years, I had been surviving. Tonight, I finally became free. Ethan smiled weakly. I think we can still fix us. I looked at the man I had once believed would grow old beside me. For the first time, I didn't see my husband. I saw a chapter that had already ended. The following Monday, I arrived at Whitmore Health headquarters before sunrise. The lobby was still quiet. Cleaning crews polished marble floors. Security guards exchanged morning greetings over paper cups of coffee. By 8 o'clock, the building would be filled with executives making decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of patients. At 6:30, it belonged to silence. I liked it that way. My office overlooked the Charles River, but I barely noticed the view anymore. 3 screens glowed across my desk. Construction reports, budget revisions, clinical expansion schedules. The South Shore Children's Hospital renovation had fallen almost 4 months behind schedule. The previous executive team blamed inflation. The contractors blamed supply shortages. The finance department blamed city permits. Everyone blamed someone else. Whenever too many people pointed fingers in different directions, I had learned to look at the numbers instead. Numbers rarely lied. People did. By 9 o'clock, 12 senior executives were seated around the conference table. Some still believed I was only there because I carried the Whitmore name. Others had begun realizing Richard rarely made emotional decisions. If he trusted me, there was probably a reason. I connected my laptop to the screen. Let's begin. No introductions, no motivational speeches, no reminders about teamwork, just work. For the next 90 minutes, we reviewed every delayed construction package. Every supplier, every revised invoice, every subcontractor. Then one spreadsheet stopped me. I enlarged it, looked again, then a third time. Who approved this consulting agreement? The room grew quiet. Executive Vice President Daniel Mercer adjusted his glasses. I did. I looked toward him. Why? It was recommended by Strategy. Strategy, Ethan's division. I clicked another document, then another, then another. By the fifth file, a pattern emerged. The same consulting firm, the same invoices, different projects, identical billing structures. Always approved through Strategy. Always just below the threshold requiring full board review. Interesting, very interesting. I closed my laptop. Take a 15-minute break. The executives filed out. Only Daniel remained behind. As soon as the door closed, he sighed. I knew you'd find it eventually. I studied him carefully. You've been waiting for someone willing to ask questions. He slid a thin envelope across the table. I couldn't report it internally. Why not? Because the approvals came from Ethan. I didn't touch the envelope. Say it, Daniel lowered his voice. For almost 2 years. Someone has been routing inflated consulting contracts through shell vendors. My pulse remained steady. How much? We estimate between $26 and $30 million. The room suddenly felt colder, not because of the money. Whitmore Health generated billions. 30 million alone wouldn't destroy the company. But corruption never traveled alone. It always brought something worse with it. Fraud, he nodded once. We couldn't prove intent, until now. I finally opened the envelope. Inside were transaction records, corporate registrations, email authorizations, bank routing summaries. None of them showed Ethan personally taking money, but every approval carried his digital signature, careless, arrogant, exactly like the man I had married. He trusted people because he assumed no one would ever question him. I looked up. Who else knows? Richard, of course he did. What did he say? Daniel hesitated. He said, leave it exactly where it is. I frowned. Why? He said someone needed enough rope to reveal who they really were. That sounded exactly like Richard. He never rushed a decision. He waited until character exposed itself. Late that afternoon, Richard asked me to meet him in his private office. He looked older than he had just a few months earlier. Not weaker, just tired. He poured tea into 2 porcelain cups before speaking. You found the contracts. I did, he nodded. I expected you would. Why didn't you stop it? Because suspicion isn't evidence. He handed me a small wooden box. Dark walnut, old, its edges worn smooth from decades of careful handling. Open it. Inside rested an antique silver pocket watch. Nothing flashy, no diamonds, no engraving beyond a single family crest. I looked at him, confused. It's beautiful. It isn't valuable because it's silver, he smiled faintly. It's valuable because of what it represents. I waited. My grandfather carried that watch. So did my father, so did I. He lifted it gently into his hands. For nearly a century. The person holding this watch wasn't the wealthiest member of the family. They were the protector, the one responsible for making sure no single generation destroyed what countless others had built. I felt my breath catch. Richard looked directly into my eyes. Ethan believes leadership is inherited. He couldn't be more wrong. He placed the watch in my palm, cold, unexpectedly heavy. The trust doesn't belong to my son. It doesn't belong to me anymore either. It belongs to the family. And until the board decides otherwise, you're its protector. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. I don't understand. You will. He smiled sadly. Sooner than either of us would like. As I left his office, I slipped the pocket watch into my handbag. No one in the hallway noticed. To anyone else, it looked like an old family keepsake. Only Richard and I knew. I wasn't carrying a watch. I was carrying the authority that could decide the future of the Whitmore empire. And somewhere else in the building, Ethan was still convinced he was destined to inherit everything. He had no idea. The person standing between him and that future was no longer his father, it was me. The first mistake didn't destroy Ethan, his confidence did. People often imagine powerful men falling because someone finally outsmarted them. Most of the time, they fall because they spend years believing the rules were written for everyone else. 3 weeks after Richard handed me the pocket watch, the quarterly board governance meeting filled the executive floor. Every voting director was present. Hospital presidents joined by video conference. Legal counsel occupied the back row. Independent trustees reviewed the agenda one final time before entering. No one expected history to be made that morning, least of all Ethan. He walked into the room wearing his usual navy suit, greeting everyone with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed the future already belonged to him. He even smiled at me. "Morning, morning." It was the first civil conversation we'd had in weeks. Neither of us mentioned the divorce. Neither of us mentioned Madison. At 10 sharp, Richard called the meeting to order. Routine approvals came first. Research funding, hospital acquisitions, compliance reviews. Everything proceeded exactly as expected. Then Richard closed his folder. Next item, the Office of Internal Governance has completed its preliminary review regarding strategic consulting expenditures. The room grew noticeably quieter. Ethan glanced toward Daniel Mercer. Daniel didn't return the look. Richard nodded once. "Claire." I stood. No dramatic pause, no theatrical presentation, just facts. Over the next 20 minutes, I walked the board through every transaction, every duplicate invoice, every shell vendor, every approval pathway, every exception hidden beneath reporting thresholds. No accusations, only evidence. The projector displayed contract after contract, email after email, authorization after authorization. When I finished, absolute silence settled across the room. Finally, one trustee spoke. "Are you alleging criminal intent?" I answered carefully. "I'm stating that governance controls failed because executive authority operated without meaningful oversight." Another director leaned forward. "Who signed these approvals?" I didn't answer. I simply changed the slide. Ethan's electronic signature filled the screen, for the first time that morning. His smile disappeared. He pushed back his chair. "Hold on. These were operational approvals. I trusted my department. No one told me." Richard interrupted him. "No one forced your signature onto those documents." Ethan looked stunned. "I didn't personally benefit. That isn't the issue." Richard's voice remained calm. "The issue is whether the future chairman exercised the judgment expected of someone responsible for a healthcare system." Ethan turned toward me. "You investigated me. I investigated the contracts. You could have warned me." I met his eyes. "I spent years warning you." He had no answer. Legal counsel distributed additional reports. Independent auditors confirmed every financial finding. Then came the final document, one Ethan had never seen before. The chairman slid a sealed envelope toward the lead trustee. "I believe we're ready." The trustee opened it slowly. His expression changed almost immediately. He looked at Richard. "You've activated Section 9? "I have." Confused whispers spread around the room. Only 3 people remained completely still. Richard, the trustee, and me. Ethan frowned. "What is Section 9? Richard looked directly at his son. "You never read the trust charter." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. The trustee adjusted his glasses. "For the record, Section 9 permits immediate suspension of succession rights when an heir demonstrates sustained failure of fiduciary responsibility." The words landed like concrete. Ethan laughed, a short, nervous laugh. "This is ridiculous. I'm your son." Richard didn't blink. "Exactly. If you weren't, this conversation would have happened years ago." The room became impossibly quiet. The trustee continued reading, effective immediately. "Mr. Ethan Whitmore's succession status is suspended pending unanimous reinstatement by the Family Trust Council. Executive voting authority is frozen. Strategic approval privileges are revoked. Interim governance responsibility transfers to the acting trust protector." He looked up. "Claire Whitmore." Every head in the room turned toward me, not with sympathy, not with surprise, with understanding. Suddenly, everything made sense. Why Richard had insisted I study governance. Why he waited instead of intervening. Why the pocket watch mattered. Ethan stared at me as though he no longer recognized the woman standing across the table. "No." He shook his head slowly. "No, you planned this." I answered softly. "No, you did. I prepared for the consequences of your choices." His breathing became uneven. "You took everything." I almost pitied him. Almost. "I didn't take your future. You signed it away." Silence. Then Richard reached into his jacket. He removed the old silver pocket watch, the same one resting in my handbag. Only this one was a replica. He smiled faintly. "My grandfather commissioned 2. One remained with the chairman. The other," he looked toward me, "belongs to the protector." Every director understood the symbolism immediately. It had never been about inheritance, it had always been about stewardship. Ethan lowered himself back into his chair, for the first time since I'd known him. He looked small, not because he'd lost power, because he'd finally realized power had never truly been his. The meeting adjourned 30 minutes later. No one celebrated. Hospitals still needed to open, patients still needed surgery, children still needed treatment. Life moved forward. As I gathered my files, Ethan spoke quietly. "Claire?" I stopped. "I would have given you everything." I looked at him for a long moment, then shook my head. That's the tragedy. I never wanted everything. I only ever wanted one man who kept his word. His eyes filled. Mine didn't, because grief had already done its work years ago. I walked out of the boardroom carrying nothing except my laptop, and the quiet certainty that the hardest battle was finally over. The board meeting ended at 12:47 p.m. By 1 o'clock, every executive in the building knew Ethan Whitmore was no longer the heir apparent. No official announcement had been released. It didn't need to be. Corporate buildings have their own nervous systems. One closed conference room, one canceled meeting, one assistant carrying sealed envelopes. Within minutes, everyone understands that something irreversible has happened. I returned to my office and closed the door. For the first time in years, there were no emergency messages waiting for me. No anonymous photographs, no rumors, no apologies. Only one voicemail from my attorney. The court accepted the filing this morning. The divorce is officially underway. I listened to it twice, not because I doubted what I'd heard, because I'd imagined those words so many times that hearing them felt strangely unreal. I deleted the message, then I picked up my phone and called home. Maria, our nanny, answered immediately. "How are the kids?" "They're in the backyard." Noah finally finished building that treehouse platform. I smiled. "Tell him I'm bringing pizza home. He'll love that." "And Emma?" Maria laughed softly. "She's covered in paint. Again." Some things, thankfully, never changed. That evening, I drove home before sunset. Not to the mansion people envied, just home. Noah spotted my car before I reached the driveway. He sprinted across the lawn wearing grass-stained sneakers and wrapped both arms around my waist. "Mom, you came early. I promised pizza." "You always keep your promises." Children don't realize how dangerous simple sentences can be. I hugged him tighter. "I'll keep this one too." Inside the kitchen, Emma proudly held up 2 tiny blue-painted hands. "I made butterflies. They're beautiful." "They don't really look like butterflies." "They do if you squint," she giggled. The sound echoed through the house. For years, I had mistaken silence for peace. Now I understood. Peace sounded like children laughing when they didn't know adults were suffering. That was the only kind worth protecting. 3 months later, the divorce became final. There wasn't a dramatic courtroom confrontation, no shouting, no last-minute confessions. Just signatures, legal language, court orders. The marriage officially ended at 10:16 on a rainy Thursday morning. When the judge wished us both well, I simply nodded. Ethan never looked away from me. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited behind metal barricades. Camera shutters exploded the moment we stepped outside. Someone shouted, "Mrs. Whitmore, do you have a statement?" I stopped, turned, and answered with exactly one sentence. "I hope my children grow up remembering love by how safely it made them feel, not by how loudly it apologized." Then I walked away. Richard retired 6 months later, not because he was forced to, because he believed institutions survived only when leaders knew when to leave. On his final afternoon at headquarters, he asked me to meet him in the old library overlooking the original hospital campus. The shelves still held medical journals dating back decades. Family photographs lined one wall. Richard placed the silver pocket watch on the table between us. "It belongs with you." I gently pushed it back. "It belongs to the Whitmores." He smiled. "It belongs to the person who protected them." Neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally, he asked, "Do you know what disappointed me most?" I waited. It wasn't Ethan's affairs. It wasn't even the money. He forgot leadership isn't about being admired. It's about making other people feel secure. He looked toward the window where young medical residents hurried between buildings carrying charts and coffee cups. "You remembered." I closed the watch and placed it back into his hand. I learned from watching someone who did. For the first time since I'd known him, Richard's eyes filled with quiet emotion. A year passed. Whitmore Health expanded 2 pediatric research centers. The South Shore project finished ahead of its revised schedule. Employee retention reached its highest level in nearly a decade. No newspapers called it revenge, because it wasn't. It was stability, something much harder to build. I heard about Ethan occasionally. He accepted a consulting position with another healthcare company several states away. He attended every visitation the court allowed. He never missed Noah's baseball games again. He brought Emma books instead of expensive toys. He seemed quieter. Regret had finally taught him what success never could. One Saturday afternoon, after Noah's game, he walked over while the children chased each other across the field. "I've been wanting to ask you something," I nodded. "Do you think they'll forgive me someday?" I watched Noah helping Emma tie her untied shoelace. Children forgive far more easily than adults, but they never forget how people made them feel. "I don't know." He lowered his eyes. "I deserve that. You deserve honesty." He looked back at me. "I spent years believing love meant someone staying. It doesn't. It means giving them reasons they never want to leave." I smiled sadly. "I figured that out too late." Neither of us said anything else. There was nothing left worth arguing about. That evening, I stood on the back porch while the children chased fireflies across the yard. The sky over Boston faded from gold to deep blue. No shouting, no pretending, no waiting for another betrayal. Just 2 children laughing because tomorrow felt safe. Noah suddenly turned around. "Mom, yeah? You know what? What? I don't worry anymore." He ran back toward his sister before I could answer. I watched them disappear beneath the old maple tree. For years, I thought winning meant exposing every lie, making every guilty person pay, taking back everything that had been stolen from me. I was wrong. Real victory arrived quietly. It looked like a little boy who no longer feared losing his mother. It sounded like a little girl laughing without understanding what had nearly broken her family. And it felt like coming home, to a house where promises no longer needed to be questioned. They were simply kept.